There's John Spear, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, I think uh,
I didn't
you
get a
know,
good night's sleep.
no, that's all right, and it's early in the morning where you are, right? So
Where
it's
I
all
am.
good.
What are we going to
Uh,
talk about today, John? Have a good show.
all right, terrific. We're going to talk about design controls and risk, and it's a topic that I'm super passionate about. And you probably have heard or read something about this topic that I've written or been a part of before, and so we're going to dive into some really depth on the topic today. And there's a few things I want to dive into. Specifically, I want to talk about the importance of things like intended use. The intended use of your product shapes everything about that product. It shapes your regulatory pathway. It shapes what you can and can't do from a marketing perspective. But it's very important when it comes to design controls, and we'll dive into that today. We're also going to talk about how that intended use translates into user needs and into design inputs, and how risk becomes a factor in this process. I also want to spend a little bit of time going through what risk should be and how we need to evolve into more of an ISO 14971 style of approach rather than just relying solely on FMEA. I'm also going to dive into design outputs and how that relates to device master records and what is verification versus validation, and how we get into design transfer as well. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to go through. I'm going to talk really fast. If you have questions, you have comments, you probably know the drill already. Please type those in. And at the tail end of our conversation today, we'll get into as many of those as we can. So design control is an introduction. And I hope this is old news for many of you, but let me just map or identify what design controls are and what FDA and where you can find this information, and also from ISO 13485 where you can find this information. And I'm really excited about the newest version of ISO 13485, the 2016 version. And the reason for that is there is one-to-one in sync with one another when it comes to design control and design and development. As you can see, FDA, ISO, the same. I want to pause here for a moment because this is a classic diagram that has been in the FDA design control guidance for over 20 years now. It's actually, I don't want to get into a deep history lesson, but actually this is a Health Canada rendering of the design and development process that FDA adopted and put into their guidance document. But this is representative of what is expected during the design and development process. Do not take this literal as thou shalt do a waterfall approach to your design and development. That is not the intent behind this diagram. This diagram is intended to show the representation, the flow, if you will, of how user needs relates to inputs, relates to outputs, relates to verification, relates to validation and design reviews and all that sort of thing. It is just a schematic to describe how things are connected. And I'm going to use that as a basis for a lot of what we're going to go through today, because again, FDA, ISO say the same thing when it comes to design controls, say the same thing regarding design and development. And essentially speaking, we're going to start with a plan. And you'll notice throughout today's presentation, as I'm going through the different sections, there are references that are listed along the top. And the 820 number that you will see is the specific FDA regulation, and the ISO 13485 references the specific clause as it pertains to this particular topic. And the first topic, design and development planning. What is a design and development plan? And I get asked this all the time. And I can tell you that there's a common mistake that I hear from a lot of people. When they think of a design and development plan, a lot of people view this as a Gantt chart or a schedule or a timeline. And yeah, there certainly is a timeline component to the things that we're trying to do. But a plan is broader than that. A plan is describing all the things that are important to this. It describes the types of design reviews that are going to be involved, when we're going to do those design reviews. A design and development plan also describes and identifies the key resources that are involved in our project. Now, the key thing about a design and development plan is it's not a one-time thing. It is something that we evolve over time. When we first define our design and development plan at the beginning of the project, it will shift as we progress through the design and development process. So it is a dynamic document. Now, let's start to dive into user needs and design inputs. And I want to spend enough time going through this because this is really the meat of any product development process. This is the most important part of your product development efforts, getting your design inputs right. Now, there's a lot of terms that people use to describe design inputs, things like requirements and product requirements and technical requirements and design inputs and design input requirements and design requirements, a lot of terms that are used. You'll find that I try to go back to what does 820.30 say, what does ISO 13485 say, so using consistent terminology. But the real essence of design inputs is getting it right the first time and understanding the context of how important your requirements are. I mean, your design and development efforts are going to be as good as a job as you've done in defining your requirements. To say it another way, if you did a poor job defining your requirements, then it's going to show as you progress through the design and development process. One of the things that I think is really important, I talked about that intended use. All right, intended use is what we claim this product is going to do, and if we understand that, understand what problem we're trying to solve, then that will help us shape and identify user needs, marketing needs, customer needs, all the other stakeholder needs, and we can collectively include those as a group of user needs. But we have to understand who is going to be involved in our product. And it's very easy to think about our device and maybe the doctor or the nurse who's going to be using our product as the sole user. But think about it. I mean, if somebody has to receive the product that they've ordered from you and and log it into their system, they have to scan a label or something like that so that it gets recorded into an inventory system, for example. Who is that person? Well, it's not the doctor or the nurse who's going to use your product. It might be somebody in purchasing or somebody in inventory management. Are those people also users? My suggestion to you is yes. So it's important to think about the complete process from the moment that your product is ordered till it's received, till it is used and reused or disposed of. You got to think about all those aspects because all of those people are part of the stakeholders as it relates to your product. And I think another thing to start to think about is we have to put these user needs really in the voice of that stakeholder or the voice of that user. Here's a great example. If you're trying to understand the intended use of your product from the perspective of the end user, you're probably not going to get engineering level of details. Now, there might be some cases here and there where you might, but it's unlikely that a doctor or nurse or an end user is going to tell you, oh, well, it's got to have a certain tensile strength and it's got to be 10 newtons plus or minus 2. You're not going to get that kind of detail typically when it comes into using it. You're going to get something like it's got to be strong enough to survive my usage of that product. And so getting a firm, clear understanding of these user needs is really instrumental in helping you to define those product requirements. And product requirements, a couple of things that are really, really important. They need to be clear. They need to be complete. They need to be objective. You need to put them in a way that can verify them. And I want to focus on that verification piece. And I'm going to talk a lot more about verification here in a bit. But now, when you're defining your design input and your product requirements, understanding how you are going to verify that downstream is really, really important because I've worked on projects where I didn't think about verification when I was defining my design inputs. And then 6 months later, we're at a point where we're starting to do our formal testing and prepare for a regulatory submission. And the way we wrote the requirements painted us in a corner. It required that we did certain things in a certain way. And now, it really made the development process much more challenging and much more difficult. And I'm going to talk about traceability here in a moment as well, but a traceability matrix is a wonderful tool, especially as you're defining your user needs and your design inputs, to help you get some perspective and some idea of what you're going to do from a verification standpoint, so you can really visualize that. But do think about how you're going to verify your design inputs as you go. Now, sometimes I've heard people use the words requirements and specifications, sometimes interchangeably, sometimes as opposites and that sort of thing. And the words do get in the way. And yes, sometimes this is a matter of semantics, but there is a difference between requirements, which describe the what, and specifications, which tell us the how. And I don't want to get too hung up on words today, but it is important for us to understand there is a difference between the what and the how. And as it relates to design controls, we're going to talk about design input versus design output. Think of design input as more of that what, the requirement, and design output is more of the how or the specification. So let's drill into this a little bit more depth and detail. But as we talked about before, that you're going to get user needs and information that's got to be easy to use. It's got to be simple. It's got to be, improve quality of life, and some of these nebulous, ambiguous types of terms. And it's our job as product developers, as engineers, as technical resources to define the specificity, the objectivity, clear, concise, verifiable terms. So just keep that in mind as you're starting to define your specific requirements, all the what's. And then as we go into the development process, we're going to determine the hows. We're going to define certain material specifications and drawings and test methods and manufacturing instructions and inspection procedures and so on. So, you know, don't be too hung up on or not having all the answers at the very beginning. All right. So when you first start a project and you get a firm grasp and understanding of your user needs and intended use of your product, you want to start to define those design inputs, and you want to be as thorough and complete as possible, because again, we're defining the what of our product with those requirements. But you may not know everything. In fact, if you did, I would say that you probably defined your design inputs too late. You probably already knew the answers. You probably were documenting things after the fact. So it's okay to use your design inputs as a starting place. What I mean by that is, I know that it has to have a certain torque ratio, but I don't know exactly what that ratio needs to be. So I'm going to put in a placeholder. I'm going to say that my catheter has to have a torque ratio of 2 TBD, or to be determined. It is okay to start with that, because the whole concept of design controls, the whole concept of design and development process is iterative. Sometimes I may need to build a prototype to be able to even define what my requirements are. I may need to it may not be, it may be very crude prototype. I may be grabbing different bits and pieces and taping them together and that sort of thing, because I need to demonstrate or prove a concept. I need to do some sort of test or some sort of analysis to even help me define my design inputs. And that's okay. That's the whole idea. Iterate, iterate, iterate until you get the specific details that you need. Now, a couple of rules, if you will, about design inputs. They have to be clear, unambiguous, verifiable. What does that mean? So think of it in a way that I need to be able to, at some point in time in this development effort, I need to be able to demonstrate that the device that I develop meets my requirements. And so that criteria, those details, that specificity that I'm defining as a design input, it needs to be stated in a way that makes it very clear, black and white, that I did or did not meet those requirements when I get to the verification stage. So that's a very important thing to think about. Now, again, it's common to think about requirements as more engineering and more in technical terms, and that's okay as well. So let's dive into a little bit of an example to kind of further illustrate that point. So let's talk about device shall be portable. Now, portable is not very specific. It's pretty ambiguous. Here are a few examples. All of these technically are portable, but if I was looking to design an iPhone and you delivered to me a suitcase with a cord and a phone receiver attached to it, that might also meet that definition of portable, but might have missed the mark a little bit. So we need to be very specific. We need to define exactly what it is that we're trying to do. That's why that specificity is important. Another thing, you leverage standards. Their biocompatibility is a good example. There are standards that exist for these types of things, and I can leverage those types of standards. IEC 60601 is another popular standard for electrical medical devices, but I can use those as ways to help drive that specificity and the level of detail and help me put my design input requirements in terms that are clear, concise, and verifiable. Nice other ambiguous example, device shall be flexible. Boy, that's so vague, and what does that mean? I mean, flexible to me and flexible to you, they're going to mean different things. So as best as we can, let's define what we mean. What is that flexibility criteria that we're trying to address? And let's build that level of detail, that type of information into the design input requirement itself. As you can see, device shall be formed into a 50 millimeter diameter coil and straightened out for a total of 50 times with no evidence of cracking or deformity, is a pretty specific requirement. And that's what we mean when we talked about being flexible in this particular case. So keep that in mind. 4 letters, FPIS, functional. What does the device do? Performance. Are there certain conditions or limits or some sort of reliability that we're trying to achieve? Interface. What does our device interact with? Are there other products that we're going to connect to in some way, shape, or form? We need to know that. We need to define that. Safety. Are there certain safety standards or criteria that we need to address? Like for example, biocompatibility. That's a great example of a safety type of item. So just be as thorough and complete as you possibly can. A couple other, it seems like nitpicky notes, and one could argue, yeah, maybe it is nitpicky, but the words do matter. They do get in the way too, but they do matter, especially when we're defining these things. There's a big difference when you're talking about shall versus should. Should sounds optional, and I'm an engineer, and a lot of engineers out there, we take things very literal. Right or wrong, we take them literal, but should is, it sounds like, oh, well, I don't have to do it because it says should do it. It doesn't say shall do it. So keep that in mind. Must to have versus nice to have. Uh, just avoid things as applicable, avoid things as required, because it's too fuzzy, it's too ambiguous. It doesn't give clear information to those who are going to be developing products. Also keep in mind system versus subsystem, and basically having a relationship or a hierarchy to define those specific things as well, very important. So talk a little bit about that feasibility phase. And I mentioned a moment ago that quote waterfall diagram that FDA leverages in their guidance document to describe what the relationship is between all the different design control elements. And don't interpret that as a waterfall approach to product development. You can do a waterfall approach to product development, it's fine. You can also be lean and agile, that's also fine. But keep in mind that it is actually a good idea to iterate and to build models and concepts to help define what it is that you're going to design and development. And so consider, being as agile, as flexible as you possibly can. One thing that I often hear from engineers and product developers is they're like, I hate design controls. And I'm like, whoa, time out. You don't hate design controls. They're like, no, I do. I'm like, all right, let's have a conversation. Let's understand that a little bit more. And what I learned is it's not that they hate design controls. Their companies have built in cumbersome, restrictive practices and processes and documentation criteria that just don't. They're not flexible. They're not agile for the product development process. They're actually limiting creativity. They're limiting development. They're becoming a burden. And so, really, what the people who hate design controls, really, what they're communicating to me is they hate their process. And if that's you, you're struggling with your process because it's too limiting, it's too burdensome, you should reach out to me. We have a better way. I'd love to tell you about it. You can contact me. My information was on the first slide, and it'll be on one of the last slides later today. But do reach out to me. Be happy to have a conversation with you about that, because the whole idea of design and development is to be flexible. It is to be, yes, don't mishear me. You need to document certain things at certain moments and times. But if you feel as though you don't like design control, you're probably in the wrong business. And here's why. Design control is all about describing and defining the criteria of your medical device and demonstrating and proving that it's safe, effective, and meets your indications for use. Folks, that's why I'm in the medical device industry, because I want to develop medical devices that are safe, effective, and meet the indications for use. And that is the essence of design controls right away. So just keep that in mind. Now, I mentioned a little bit about traceability, and I want to bring in why this is so important. And first and foremost, it's important because traceability links and connects everything that you're doing during the design and development process together. It shows the relationship, it shows that flow from intended use through your user needs and all the way through inputs and outputs and verification and validation. So it shows that relationship. And so much so that the recent version of ISO 13485 2016 understands the importance of that and has made this a requirement, a regulatory requirement for your quality system. There are several places in the 2016 version of the standard where it describes traceability. There's a whole section for traceability, and I've quoted a couple of these items from the 1345 standard. But FDA cares about that as well, and they've cited companies in 43s and in warning letters for not having traceability. So this is a practice that is required. And it's very important to show that relationship, how information flows throughout the design and development process. It's one of the reasons why we started Greenlight Guru 5 years ago, is to solve that problem specifically for medical device professionals such as yourself. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about how we do that and how we help you with traceability, like I said, be sure to reach out. So let me dive into risk management. I know I'm going a million miles an hour right now and having a great time. I love design controls. I love risk management. I know that may make me weird in your book, and I'm okay with that. Somebody has to love it. But I'm really passionate about helping new products get to market quickly, safely, effectively. Now, risk management is one of those areas that is very confusing to people. And there's a lot of reasons for why. And if you want me to dive into that and explain how we've got to where we are today, I'd be happy to help share that history lesson. frankly, I don't have time to go into all that nuances today. But what I will tell you today is that there are, from what I've seen, there are kind of two camps. There are camps that are very heavily reliant, almost exclusively reliant on doing just FMEAs for the risk management. And then there are companies who are starting to make that transition, or who have already made that transition to adapting to more of an ISO 14971 approach to risk management. My advice to you is to shift to the ISO 14971 camp because of how important that is and how recognized that is by FDA, by EU, by Health Canada, by TGA in Australia, basically by every regulatory body in the world in the medical device industry. They recognize ISO 14971. And I want to take you through that process and make sure that you understand a couple of key things about risk management. I hope what I'm telling you is old hat and old news to you. I hope you're in that ISO 14971 camp. If so, bear with me a few moments. If your company's still relying on FMEA, and that's the only way that you approach that, please contact me. The reason for that is FMEA, it's a very good tool, don't mishear me, but it has a point in time. And FMEA stands for Failure Modes Effects Analysis. It is a bottom-up approach to risk management that looks at a single fault failure and cause and effect type of relationship. Now, when we think about risk, I mean, let me back up a slide. If you read what ISO 14971 describes as risk, it is the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. This is not John's definition. This isn't Greenlight's definition. This is ISO 14971. And when it talks about hazardous situation, it's a circumstance where events have happened, and it's not just a single fault failure. All right. So that's point number one that I want you to take home if you're strong in the FMEA camp. The other point that I want you to understand is it implies that it has to be a failure mode. Now, let's think about a fairly common commodity medical device, a vascular needle. It has a grinded bevel on the tip of this metal cannula, and its intended use is to puncture a vein or artery to gain access to the bloodstream, right? I can use that needle exactly the way it is intended, exactly the way that it was supposed to, with zero failures, and there's still a hazardous situation. There's still possible harm. How many people, but you can raise your hand if this is you, are afraid of needles? I mean, one of my kids, the moment that they see a needle, they might faint and pass out because there is that fear, all right? It doesn't matter that the device was used exactly correctly, exactly the way I intended it to. There's still a hazardous situation. There's still a possible harm. And I think that's a really key thing to kind of wrap our head around from a risk management standpoint, is it's not just about when things fail or when things break. The other thing that's really key to keep in mind is single fault failure versus a sequence of events. And the 14971 describes it is important to understand the entire situation, all the events that lead to that particular hazardous situation. So just keep that in mind. And I'd be happy to chat with you a lot more about that. But let me give you kind of a framework as far as the risk management process. Kind of boiled it down into 10 steps. And again, this is all based on what you can read and follow from an ISO 14971 standpoint. So key thing, you got to define your framework. You got to determine your process, who has what role. And the other important thing is risk management and design and development. I mean, they should be in sync with one another. They both are kind of different ways of viewing the safety and efficacy of your product, or evaluating the safety and effectiveness of your product. The other thing is you need to be able to integrate and tie and connect your design control and risk management workflows together. Does one start before the other? That's debatable. But if one were to start before the other, which one would you start with? Would you start with risk or would you start with design? I guess the way I look at it is it's kind of a flow back and forth. Like once I understand the intended use of my product, then one of the things that I'm going to start to understand is I want to understand what are the hazards that are involved with that. And when I work with clinicians and physicians and people who are going to be end users of my product, they're going to be a really great resource to help me identify this type of information. So understanding how it's used, understanding the circumstances and the events and the environment and all sorts of things, I could leverage and work with those end users to better understand that. A doctor or a nurse can tell me about all the hazardous situations and the harms that might be involved in my product, so I can leverage those resources. And once I understand that, then now I can use that information actually to feed into my design and development process to help me design and develop better design input requirements, so that as I'm going through the development process and building prototypes and getting closer and closer to where I'm ready to do final testing, I've already factored in elements of risk as part of that design and development process. Really great idea. So you can see how really they flow back and forth and are in sync with one another. It's very important that your processes allow that. So many times I see companies get to a moment in time and they're like, oh crap, I got to do the FMEA. And it's oftentimes it's too late, and oftentimes it's a checkbox, and oftentimes there's a lot of time spent for something that adds very little value. We're checking a box. Joe and I have talked about check boxers before. Don't be a check boxer when it comes to FMEA. Don't be a check boxer when it comes to risk. Build it into your process. Make sure you're adapting your approach to align with ISO 14971. I talked about a moment ago that the criteria that really makes up risk. Risk is the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm with the severity of that harm. So there's two factors, probability, severity. Those are two things that we should be evaluating. We should define our risk acceptability criteria. It should be commensurate with our products that we're designing and developing, and we should make sure that we define what risk means to our company. Keep that in mind. So other ways that we can dive into this, I mean, there's all sorts of information. Some of it's readily available, but if I'm designing a medical device, I shouldn't do it in a vacuum. I should try to leverage the information that's in the public domain. Like I can go to FDA's MAUDE database to see if there are any other similar products to mine that may have adverse events or issues, and I can understand what risks are already prevalent or present for products that are going to be similar to mine, so that I can factor that in and feed that into my risk management and ultimately into the design and development process of my product. The key idea is you need to be capturing your risk assessment. Now, like I described to you a moment ago, I want to start risk as early as I can during the design and development process, and I want to connect and relate how all of these things tie together so that I can get a picture of what's happening with my device. Sometimes people look at the high risk areas and they're trying to avoid it. You're trying to play a numbers game. And if that's your approach, you've missed the point with risk management. The whole idea is if I start risk management early in my design and development process, my risk may be high. That's okay. In fact, I would encourage that. So high risk items might be something I don't know. I need to do some more research. I might need to do a proof of concept prototype or modeling or some bench testing to better understand what this is even to begin with. And so again, this is what I mean about helping drive your design and development activities, so that as you start to identify certain risk controls, certain design features, certain testing activities, and so on, I can use that as a means and proof and evidence to control, reduce, and mitigate my risk to a more acceptable level. It's the whole idea. And I need to make sure that I'm factoring in kind of three levels when it comes to risk controls. I know the most common approach that most people get to, and I think usually the reason this is because we start risk way too late in the process. But the most common thing that people do is like slap it on the label, put it in the IFU, the instructions for use, put a warning sticker on it. Folks, labeling is a last resort when it comes to risk control. We shouldn't just be slapping a label or adding some statement in the instructions for use. If you start risk too late in your design and development process, sometimes that's what you're left with. That's the only option that you have because the product has already been designed and tested and so on. But if you incorporate risk management earlier in your design and development process, you can use risk controls and better incorporate that as a design feature and make sure that you're actually putting in the appropriate protective measures into your product, redundant measures into your product, so that it actually does control, reduce, and mitigate that risk. So as I mentioned, design outputs, design verification activities, design validations, those are all proof and objective evidence that we can use to corroborate and support our decisions and when it comes to risk assessments, risk evaluations. And I want to be able to tie that back to what I'm doing into the design and development process, as I've already shared with you. This is one of the key things that Greenlight and only Greenlight does when it comes to EQMS software platforms. If we have a design and development workflow that is designed only for the medical device industry, we have a risk management workflow that is designed specifically to comply with ISO 14971, and we've integrated those two workflows together. No one else on the planet Earth has ever done that. So just keep that in mind. But I need to evaluate what is the overall risk acceptability of my product. I need to make decisions. And this is another place where that voice of user can come in super handy, especially the end user of my product, a clinician. I know some companies I've talked to, they actually have physicians who are on staff, the chief medical officer. Those are great resources to be able to tap into, because there's this idea that I need to make a decision as to the risk acceptability of my product. In many cases, I may need to determine in a way the medical benefits versus the risk of that product. And so you need to be able to document these decisions, and it needs to be supported from some proven evidence to demonstrate that. And all of this information that you're doing from a risk management standpoint gets boiled into a risk management report. It's a summary of all the things that you're doing from a risk management standpoint. And here's the beautiful part about risk management. It's a life cycle process. So you don't just do it one time during the design and development process, check a box and be done with it. The idea is it's living throughout the entire product life cycle. So now as you have feedback and complaints and audits and all these things that start to have a non-conformance, those all feed into and need to be risk-based in their methodology and approach to begin with, but also should be feeding into the assessment that you've done in the past. Did you think of this particular event or this situation or the scenario? Did you properly estimate the severity? Did you properly estimate the probability? And then use that proof and evidence, that data, that information about the product performance as a means to mitigate, control, drive further design decisions, improvements, and enhancements, and so on. So treat it as a life cycle process. All right, so continuing on with our story, let's talk a little bit about design reviews. When do you do them? How many do you do? How often do they occur? All these sorts of things, big questions. Now, the key thing is I want you to leave with today is the number and timing of design reviews is going to vary from one product to the next. Some products that you're developing may have multiple design reviews for multiple different stages of design inputs. Others may have combine all design control, several design control elements into a single design review. So how and when you do design reviews is a function of design and development planning. And it could change throughout the course of a project. You may identify early on that we need to do X number of design reviews, and then you get into the design and development activities and you say, well, we need to add, we need to change, we need to update, and that's okay. It's a function of design and development planning to determine how many and when and who's involved in that sort of thing. Now, let me hit on a couple of thou shalt absolutely do as part of the design review process. One thing is that all design control information that you're documenting throughout the design and development process must be part of design review at some point in time. So you need to be able to show and demonstrate traceability of all of your design controls being included as part of a design review. I already talked about the importance of the design plan. The other must-have is you must have an independent reviewer included as part of the design review process. And there's, I don't want you all to get too hung up on that, but grab somebody from another project team, or if you need to call somebody to be part of your design review, give me a ring. We'll help figure that out for you. But have someone independent of the design and development efforts be a part of the design review process. I go back to this chart again, the representation of how information is tied together. And you can see the intent is very clear. It is an expectation that you have all of your design control elements be part of design review. So understand how important that is. Now, design history file, what's in, what's out, what does that include, all that sort of thing. Now, up until the 13485 2016, the ISO standard didn't really talk about what a design history file is, and now in the current version of that standard, it does talk about the results of your design and development efforts need to be maintained within appropriate documentation and files and so on. So there is an expectation. They don't use the word design history file, but there is an expectation that you're documenting and maintaining DHFs throughout the entire design and development process. And so think of your design history file is your source of truth for your design control efforts. So all the things that you're documenting get contained within a design history file. All right, moving on. We talked about a moment ago where outputs or inputs are like requirements, the what, and outputs are like specifications or the how. So let's talk about design outputs, and let me make the relationship between design outputs and your device master record as well. So again, design outputs are like specifications. They're like the how. And it can include a lot of stuff, things like drawings and specifications, material specifications, manufacturing instructions, packaging, labeling, inspection, so on and so forth. So the analogy that I like to use that I think for me makes it very clear is I think of a recipe. So imagine Joe wanted me to make him a cake for his birthday. And I don't know what kind of cake that he likes, but I'm going to assume that he's a big fan of chocolate cake. So I find my favorite chocolate cake recipe, and it tells me how many eggs, how much flour, how much sugar, how much cocoa, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to get a list of ingredients that go into making this cake. And beyond that, I'm going to get specific instructions. How long do I need to mix, and what order should I put the ingredients in when I'm preparing the cake batter, and what kind of pan do I need to bake it in, and for how long and at what temperature. So I get a full set of instructions. And I use that analogy because think of your medical device as the same way, and specifically think of design outputs as the same way. Design outputs are the recipe for my medical device. It tells me all the components, parts, and pieces that are going to go into making this product, as well as the instructions and the specific criteria that are important for how and what order I need to put things together in, and when I need to check that something is done correctly, and all that sort of thing. So use that. I like it. If it's helpful for you, use that recipe analogy to describe design outputs, because it is the recipe for your medical device. And the other key thing to think about from a design output standpoint is the design outputs that you're designing and establishing and developing during the product development process. It is the preliminary device master record, because a device master record is more of something that's a production controlled type of thing. But device master record is also the recipe of your product. It just so happens that now this is what we manage and maintain under control once we transfer to manufacturing. But design outputs and device master record, they're the same thing, folks. One's just during development, one is post-development. So keep that in mind. Key thing, again, I'm going to keep coming back to traceability, because you need to define and understand how your specific outputs, how the ingredients of your recipe of your medical device tie to the specific design inputs. You need to know what specifications relate to which requirements, and you need to be able to build that traceability as you're going through the design and development process. So moving on, going 100 miles an hour, such a great audience, such a fun topic, but let's talk about something that confuses a lot of people, and you know, it is challenging, it is tricky, and I hope to make that a little bit clear, but let's talk about design verification versus design validation. And I want to pause here for a moment, because I think it's really important to understand the context, or the perception, really, or the viewer, if you will, of verification versus validation. So verification, you remember I talked about a moment ago when I talked about design inputs and defining requirements and stating requirements in a way that shows and demonstrates that they can be verified. And this is where this topic it really makes a lot of sense, because I have my design inputs, my requirements, the what. I came up with my design outputs, the specifications, the how, and now I need to be able to prove or demonstrate that the how addresses the what. I need to prove and demonstrate that specifications meet the requirements. And this is the essence of design verification. Did I design my medical device correctly? That's the key question that I'm asking as part, or answering as part of design verification. Now, design validation goes back to those user needs. So I talked about that intended use at the very beginning, and how that intended use helps me to identify the user needs of my product, and how that user needs helps me identify the design inputs. Well, now validation is the step toward the tail end of my design and development efforts that's going to come full circle back to those user needs. And it's going to answer the big question: did I design the correct medical device? So I went through all of these iterations, and hopefully there were confirmations along the way that I basically checked back in. I didn't just talk to the end users at the beginning of the project and then not again until the tail end, because I probably would have missed the mark. But this is like that final proof, that final evidence that demonstrates that I designed the correct medical device. So again, that relationship from a verification standpoint: input, requirement; output, specification; verification, did I design my medical device correctly? So talked about the importance of considering verification when you're defining your design inputs. I want to emphasize that again. When I'm writing design input requirements, that's a wonderful time. That is a great time to start to think ahead. What is it that I'm going to have to do to verify this particular requirement? Now, the key thing that I think we get stuck into thinking about from a verification standpoint is that it is testing. Yes, testing is often a big part of design verification, but it can also be other methods that we're deploying. I could do some sort of analysis or some sort of inspection. It doesn't always have to be testing, but I need to be able to prove and demonstrate that my acceptance criteria is being addressed. So just some things to think about. I've got my design input requirement: catheter shall have a torque ratio of 1:1. My design outputs, the specifications, I might have some particular material specifications, I might have a drawing, you know, I might have a catheter assembly, whatever the case may be. I've defined certain ingredients of that recipe, if you will. And then there are certain activities from a verification standpoint that will prove and demonstrate that my specifications meet those requirements. So just kind of another way to look at it: testing methods, inspection methods, analysis methods, those are all acceptable means. I got to think about the method that I'm using for design verification, and the method has has to meet the mean. So, for example, if torque ratio is something that would be my requirement, it's probably going to lean more toward a test because there's some sort of way that I have to prove and demonstrate that. But there are other criteria that may not require a test. Like if I talk about being a certain length, I may not have to do a test to prove that something is a certain length. I may be able to do some sort of inspection or analysis in that particular case. So yes, testing is an important part of your verification, but don't just fall into the trap of everything has to be a test. There are other means that you can leverage from a verification standpoint. And in all cases, I need to be documenting my results because that's the proof, the evidence to show and demonstrate that my outputs meet my inputs. It's proof and evidence that I've designed my product correctly. Some key tips from verification. I've already hit on these earlier in today's conversation, but inputs, very important component of the design verification process, clear, verifiable, concise. We also need to make sure that our design outputs are defined in a way that allow us to accurately and appropriately and objectively demonstrate that the inputs have been addressed. So, I need to have appropriate documentation or drawings or specifications. I need to have, them documented in a way from a design output standpoint. Acceptance criteria, very, very important topic, and also one that can be a little bit confusing. My personal preference, when I define a thorough, complete, concise design input requirement, it should contain acceptance criteria. But at the very least, I can also look at things like outputs. Like I may have a certain dimension or an attribute that I'm defining, or a go, no go type of decision that needs to be made in my product, and I want to make sure that that's very clear. And I may also define certain type of sample size and criteria and so on within my verification plans and protocols. Regardless, I need to define what acceptance criteria means to me, and I need to be able to prove and demonstrate that that's happened. Traceability, it's probably the sixth time that I've mentioned that, but traceability is very important when it comes to verification and validation, because we need to show that how that thread flows throughout the entire design and development process. We need to show that connectivity. And verification is one of those confirmation points in time during the design and development where I'm tying design inputs and design outputs together. And then I'm going to talk about validation, kind of tying it all together at the tail end. But I need to be able to show and demonstrate traceability. Speaking of validation, I talked about the voice of customer. That end user is a very critical component to design validation. But validation is proving and demonstrating that we've designed the correct medical device. Ties back to those user needs. And so it's very important to keep that in mind. A couple of things to keep, some tips to think about for validation. I should be documenting a design validation plan. And I need to start this pretty early. So when I'm starting to define my user needs early on, when I start to understand my intended use, again, that's going to help shape and guide what I need to be doing from a regulatory standpoint. What is my pathway and those sorts of things, which can, in large part, influence what I need to do from a design validation standpoint as well. Like, for example, if I have a class 3 device that's going to require a clinical trial, that clinical trial is a pretty important part in the design control process, because in many respects, it's probably going to help me from a design validation standpoint. But if I am a class 2 device and I don't have to do a clinical trial, I may not do my design validation may be different. I may be doing some sort of simulated use, or I might be doing some animal studies. So that factors in very early on, and keep that in mind as we're going through the design and development process, that might evolve as well. But I got to think about what I'm going to do from a validation standpoint, because if I need to do clinicals, well, how many patients, how many facilities, how many products do I need? Because if I have to go down that path, that's going to basically have a strong impact on my budget, my timeline, and my ability to execute. And if I can do this design validation, if I can accomplish that through some other means, like an animal study or even simulated use, I got to factor those things in, because it does shape the design and development efforts and what's required and who needs to be involved. Now, I do want to talk about a couple of things that get real confusing in the topic of design validation. One key thing is we need to get end users involved in the design validation process. And the term clinical evaluation is one that gets a little bit fuzzy. Some people interpret that to mean actual use. Clinical evaluation is really intended to mean that somebody from the customer, from the clinical aspect, is involved in evaluating the product. It doesn't have to mean actual use. Yes, actual use is a type of clinical evaluation. I know it's very confusing, and I probably just made it more confusing, but just keep in mind that sometimes from a validation standpoint, I can do simulated use and accomplish that. Now, the key thing is that user the end user needs to be involved in that design validation process. I need to be able to prove that I've designed the correct medical device. And who else can do that other than the end user? Now, a key component of design validation is absolutely going to involve some sort of testing. And it's going to, it could be clinical testing, it could be animal testing, it could be simulated use testing, but there is a strong testing component with design validation. Now, I should be defining protocols and methods and acceptance criteria as part of that process, absolutely as well. But I need to be able to show that traceability and linkage and how everything ties in. And the whole idea behind this is once I have acceptable verification results and once I have acceptable validation results, I've demonstrated full traceability throughout the entire design and development process. So said another way, I am demonstrating that my product is safe and effective and meets the needs of the end user. And that's the essence of design controls. Last little bit that I want to cover today is design transfer. And I think sometimes when people think about design transfer, there are a few misconceptions. And I think one of the misconceptions is that this is a moment in time. Sometimes we think about, I got to do this, I got to do a plan, I got to do inputs, I got to do outputs, and design reviews and verification, validation, and then I'm ready for design transfer. And that's not really accurate because design transfer is one of these things that's kind of continual as I'm going through the entire design and development process. Because I don't just do, generally, I'm not just going to do design and development for the sake of doing design and development. Generally, what I'm trying to do is design and develop a product so that I can launch it into the marketplace so that I can help patients who can benefit from my technology. So I'm moving to a point where I want to get into the market. And so I got to think about design transfer as I'm progressing through the process. I talked about design outputs being the recipe for your product, and that eventually the design outputs will become what's known as the device master record. Well, that's a design transfer concept that I'm establishing the recipe for my product. I'm calling them design outputs. That's an element of design transfer. When I get into verification and I'm building units for testing and analysis purposes, I'm basically following that recipe to build specific units. Well, that is a level of manufacturing that it's involved in that point. So there's design transfer that's involved there. And certainly when I get into design validation, any units that I use for design validation purposes need to be production equivalent. And so I need to have some level of design transfer that's involved there. So this is a continual process that starts very early on in the design and development process. And there might be a final moment toward the tail end where you decide I'm no longer in development and now I'm in production, and mark that moment in time. But just keep in mind that there's a lot of things that go into the design and development process. I need to make sure my design outputs have been correctly transferred into a formal DMR with formal engineering level of control or quality level of control items. I need to make sure that I've defined all of my supplier and I have agreements and evaluations and qualifications and I've got monitoring in place. I need to make sure all my processes have been validated. I need to make sure all my inspection methodology has been defined and the methodology has been validated and so on. I need to address calibration. I need to address maintenance. So there are a lot of factors that go into design transfer, so just keep that in mind.